Hello student, welcome to the lecture on Constitution. After this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Explain the preamble of the US Constitution, discuss the US Constitution, understand the US government and politics, understand the Constitutional Convention, discuss the ratification of Constitution, understand the fundamental law, understand the civil rights movement. Preamble of the US Constitution. The preamble to the Constitution is a short one-sentence introduction to the Constitution. It explains that the document proposes to establish a more perfect government, complete with justice, tranquility and liberty. It states, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and secure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." These are the words of the preamble to our United States Constitution. They are words that our founder chose to represent why they were writing the Constitution. These words describe much of the content of this founding document of our nation. United States Constitution. The US Constitution has been the model for many countries' constitutions around the world. It is a great document that has withstood the test of time in creating a government that has functioned well for over 200 years while preserving individual liberty and justice. The US Constitution is the oldest national constitution and the shortest. The original US Constitution is on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The first article of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch. The Senate and the House of Representatives are the two houses that compose this branch of the government. The United States Congress, which is outlined in the first section of this article. Section 1 also denotes lawmaking procedure and the limitation of congressional power. Section 2 and 3 of Article 1 explain in detail the two houses of Congress. Did you know that there was a branch of government that consists primarily of only two individuals? Well, that is about Article 2 is all about. The executive branch. Article 2 establishes the executive branch headed by the President. The main purpose of the executive branch is to carry out laws passed by the Congress. Article 2 also establishes election procedures and qualification for both the President and Vice President, completing Article 2 and the second branch of our government. When the United States government moved to Washington, D.C. in 1824, they forgot to design a building for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heads the judicial branch of the government established in Article 3. Article 3 spells out the power of the Supreme Court, defining its ability to create lower federal courts. All federal courts are given the ability to rule on cases. Treason against America is also defined in Article 3. States here, states there, states everywhere, states upon states. That is all Article 4 talks about. It goes on and on about how states can be admitted to the Union, interstate relations and civil rights of different states. It talks about the relations between states, state to the government, the relation between state and the government, even the relation to you and the state. That is one good thing about Article 4. It states the US government will protect all states of the Union from invasion or domestic violence. Article 4 just makes you feel good about being an American. Article 5 is inarguably the longest article of the Constitution. It establishes the means by which the Constitution can be amended. Article 6 is the basic of the Supremacy Clause, it establishes that congressional laws, the Constitutional and US treaties shall be enshrined the law. The final article of the US Constitution does not establish any new law making procedure or new branches of government, and instead makes it all happen. Article 7 states that the Constitution is validated by a right application process declaring its effect after being ratified by 9 states. Many amendments to the Constitution have been made through the years. The first 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791. The Bill of Rights preserved the right of people, including the freedom of speech and religion, the right to a speedy trial, and others. Later, 17 additional amendments were added. So far, there have been 27 amendments to the US Constitution. Now, this video here will shed some more light on the US Constitution.
What up, all you young dudes and dudettes? Today we're going to have a little civics lesson to make up for what you've been learning in school. This is your Constitution. This is your Constitution in Washington, D.C. Now, some of you youngsters may be wondering, Clavin on the culture, what is this thing called the Constitution? And by the way, what's that cylindrical roll of white tissue? Well, let me answer your first question while standing very far away from you. The Constitution is a document written on crinkly brown paper by assorted men wearing wigs. These crinkly brown wig men were the descendants of other assorted crinkly people who were so desperate to escape from Europe, they crossed the ocean in rickety, unsafe vessels, lacking even the barest creature comforts, although the smarter ones avoided commercial airlines and just came over on ships. The new American crinklies were tired of living under European systems of government that allowed a small group of elites to lord it over ordinary people, instituting poorly conceived programs paid for by taxing the productive, while they themselves sat around drinking their venti half-calf cinnamon mocha frappuccinos and passing off their opinions as facts in the New York Times of Europe. The question was, people love power, and once they get their hands on it, they won't willingly let it go, but will instead connive for more. Actually, that's not a question. In fact, there is no question about it. So, the Americans conceived a clever plan. Disguising themselves as white-haired old women, they dipped feathers in ink because if they were caught with pens, they'd be hanged by the British. Using these ink feathers, they wrote down laws intended to limit the powers of the government so the people's representatives wouldn't turn into corrupt, abusive, self-important busybodies, burdening the nation with intrusive legislation no one understands while spending money they don't even have. In Europe. The crinkly brown founders called these government-limiting laws the Constitution because they are what constitute America. You don't have to be a descendant of the original Whigmen to be an American. Even if you're elected president of the whole shebang, all you really have to do is preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution with its underlying philosophy of individual liberty, equal treatment, and limited government power. So, young people, since the Constitution is so important to our way of life, let's try to get a clearer understanding of how it works in specific cases. For instance, let's listen in as a CNSnews.com reporter asks Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi what constitutional provision grants Congress authority to force people to buy health insurance.
Are you serious? Are you serious?
Well, let's ask Congressman Phil Hare from Illinois.
I don't worry about the Constitution on this, to be honest.
Pete Stark, he's been a California congressman for more than 35 years. Pete, you don't pretend the Constitution lets the federal government do anything, do you?
The federal government, yes, can do most anything in this country.
So, there you have your answer, which is that many of the people we trust with our government turn out to be just the sort of power-hungry lowlifes from whom the founding wig wearers were trying to protect us. Now, perhaps some of you young folks are thinking in your hep groovy lingo, what's the big whoop? Chill, dude. Don't harsh my buzz. Unfortunately, I don't understand what you're saying and can't respond. But I can tell you that the freedom you enjoy today is the exception in history, not the rule. Grow complacent in its strength, ignorant of its foundation, or careless of the rules of its sustainment, and it will be lost to what James Madison called the gradual and silent encroachments of those in power.
United States government and politics. The government of the United States is based on a written constitution, the shortest in the world in fact. This constitution consists of a preamble, 7 articles and 27 amendments. From this document, the entire federal government was created. It is a living document whose interpretation has changed over time. The amendment process is such that while not easily amended, US citizens are able to make necessary changes over time. The Constitution created 3 separate branches of government. Each branch has its own powers and areas of influence. At the same time, the Constitution created a system of checks and balances that ensured no one branch would reign supreme. The 3 branches are legislative branch. This branch consists of the Congress, which is responsible for making the federal laws. Congress consists of 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Executive branch. The executive power lies with the President of the United States, who is given the job of executing, enforcing and administrating the laws and government. The bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. Judicial branch. The judicial power of the United States is vested in the Supreme Court and the federal courts. The job is to interpret and apply US laws through cases brought before them. Another important power of the Supreme Court is that of judicial review, whereby they can rule unconstitutional laws. This video here will give us a better understanding of the concept.
Have you ever wondered who has the authority to make laws or punish people who break them? When we think of power in the United States, we usually think of the president, but he does not act alone. In fact, he is only one piece of the power puzzle, and for very good reason. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the United States government was in a state of change. The Founding Fathers knew that they did not want to establish another country that was ruled by a king. So the discussions were centered on having a strong and fair national government that protected individual freedoms and did not abuse its power. When the new Constitution was adopted in 1787, the structure of the infant government of the United States called for 3 separate branches, each with their own powers, and a system of checks and balances. This would ensure that no one branch would ever become too powerful, because the other branches would always be able to check the power of the other 2. These branches work together to run the country and set guidelines for us all to live by. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Many people feel that the Founding Fathers put this branch in the document first because they thought it was the most important. The legislative branch is comprised of 100 U.S. senators and 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is better known as the U.S. Congress. Making laws is a primary function of the legislative branch, but it is also responsible for approving federal judges and justices, passing the national budget, and declaring war. Each state gets 2 senators and some number of representatives depending on how many people live in that state. The executive branch is described in Article 2 of the Constitution. The leaders of this branch of government are the President and Vice President, who are responsible for enforcing the laws that Congress sets forth. The President works closely with a group of advisors known as the Cabinet. These appointed helpers assist the President in making important decisions within their area of expertise, such as defense, the Treasury, and Homeland Security. The executive branch also appoints government officials, commands the armed forces, and meets with leaders of other nations. All that combined is a lot of work for a lot of people. In fact, the executive branch employs over 4 million people to get everything done. The third branch of the U.S. government is the judicial branch and is detailed in Article 3. This branch is comprised of all the courts in the land, from the federal district courts to the U.S. Supreme Court. These courts interpret our nation's laws and punish those who break them. The highest court, the Supreme Court, settles disputes among states, hears appeals from state and federal courts, and determines if federal laws are constitutional. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and unlike any other job in our government, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, or for as long as they want to stay. Our democracy depends on an informed citizenry, so it is our duty to know how it works and what authority each branch of government has over its citizens. Besides voting, chances are that sometime in your life you'll be called upon to participate in your government, whether it is to serve on a jury, testify in court, or petition your congressperson to pass or defeat an idea for a law. By knowing the branches, who runs them, and how they work together, you can be involved, informed, and intelligent.
Now, the Constitution is built on 6 basic principles. These are deeply ingrained in the mindset and landscape of US government. The 6 fundamental principles are popular sovereignty. This principle states that the source of governmental power lies with the people. This belief stems from the concept of the social contract and the idea that government should be for the benefit of a citizen. If the government is not protecting the people, it should be dissolved. Limited government. Since the people give government its power, government itself is limited to the power given to it by them. In other words, the US government does not derive its power from itself. It must follow its own laws, and it can only act using powers given to it by the people. Separation of powers. As stated previously, the US government is divided into 3 branches so that no one branch has all the power. Each branch has its own purpose to make the laws, execute the laws, and interpret the laws. Checks and balances. In order to further protect the citizen, the Constitution set up a system of checks and balances. Basically, each branch of government has a certain number of checks it can use to ensure the other branches do not become too powerful. For example, the President can veto legislation, the Supreme Court can declare acts of Congress constitutional, and the Senate must approve treaties and presidential appointments. Judicial review. This is a power that allows the Supreme Court to decide whether acts and laws are unconstitutional. Federalism. One of the most complicated foundation of the US is the principle of federalism. This is the idea that the central government does not control all the power in the nation. States also have powers reserved to them. This division of powers does overlap and sometimes leads to problems such as what happened with the response to Hurricane Katrina between the state and federal governments. Take a look at this video here to get a better grasp on the basic principle of the United States Constitution.
The United States Constitution is the backbone of our government, and it is built around 6 basic principles. The first words of the Constitution are "we the people." These words describe the first principle, popular sovereignty. This means that the government's power is given to it by the people. The next principle is limited government. Similar to popular sovereignty, limited government means that no government is all-powerful, and it may only perform duties that the people have given it to do. In other words, no one and no government is above the law. Another word for this is constitutionalism. The U.S. government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. This is the principle of separation of powers. Each branch has its own functions, and those functions are reserved for that branch alone. In essence, the legislative branch writes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Each of these branches can be checked by one another to be sure that no branch becomes too powerful. This is the principle of checks and balances. For example, the president, or chief executive, may reject or veto any bill written by the legislative branch. Likewise, the judicial branch can determine that a law passed by the legislative and the executive is unconstitutional. This process is known as judicial review. The 6th and final principle is federalism. Federalism means that power is divided between the central government and the state governments. All power that is not granted to the central or federal government is left to the states.
While the Constitution sets up the system of government, the actual way in which the offices of Congress and the presidency are filled are based upon the American political system. Many countries have numerous political parties, but the US exists under two-party system. The two major parties in America are the Democratic and Republican parties. They act as coalitions and attempt to win elections. We currently have a two-party system because of not only historical precedent and tradition, but also the electoral system itself. The fact that America has a two-party system does not mean that there is no role for third parties in the American landscape. In fact, they have often swept elections even if their candidates have in most cases not won. There are four major types of third parties: ideological parties, example Socialist Party; single issue parties, example Right to Life Party; economic protest parties, example Greenback Party; splinter parties, example Bull Moose Party; constitutional convention. Delegates from 11 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787 to revise the Articles. Instead, however, delegates at the Constitutional Convention, sometimes called the Philadelphia Convention, quickly decided to scrap the Articles and write a document that created an entirely new, stronger national government, the Cincinnati. As the delegates gathered to change the government, a group of disgruntled veteran officers also met in Philadelphia. Calling themselves the Cincinnati, the veterans hoped that George Washington would join them and take control of the government. Washington's refusal to attend the meeting, let alone lead a rebellion, was an important moment. Washington carried a lot of influence, so his support legitimized the Constitutional Convention and delegitimized splinter groups such as the Cincinnati, the framers of the Constitution. The group that met during the Constitutional Convention included some of the most prominent men of the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary era. George Washington attended the convention and was elected its president along with Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Roger Sherman, among others. The framers of the Constitution were wealthier and better educated than the average American. Nearly all of them had experience in state and national governments, and many of them had fought in the Revolution. The missing founders, although the Constitutional Convention included many luminaries, several famous figures from the Revolutionary era did not attend. Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, for example, were not there, and both expressed serious reservations about the final document. Thomas Jefferson was also absent because he was serving as the American ambassador to France at the time. The aims of the framers. The framers met in Philadelphia to create a stronger national government that would better protect and enhance liberty by preventing tyranny. Siya's rebellion and the state's inability to cooperate with one another had also demonstrated the weaknesses inherited in the Articles of Confederation, and many worried that Britain would take advantage of American weaknesses. At the same time, however, the framers did not want to abolish the state governments. At this time, most Americans felt more loyalty toward their state governments than to Congress, and strong local government made sense for the operation of a large nation such as the United States. Look at this video here to know more on Constitutional Convention.
Pushing for what in the 18th century they call a vigorous or energetic government. Since even actually before the Americans won the war. He's opposed to the Articles. He thinks that this will fail. He quickly brings to his side men like Washington, John Jay, Madison, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, who all also see that the Confederation government is going to be inadequate for what the nation needs as opposed to what the Revolution might have needed. And they stage a series of smaller conventions that produce a sense that there's a groundswell for amending the government. And after a farmers' uprising in Massachusetts, which scares the American elite, who fear that Poor men will seize their property, slaves will rise up against their masters, and there will be no protection, no law and order. The Confederation Congress agrees to convene a convention that will suggest amendments that will strengthen the Confederation. And to this convention come a group of pretty much self-selected men from 12 states. Rhode Island doesn't want to have anything to do with it. They're very happy controlling their own life. And these men are nationalists on the whole. They're men who have a vision of a stronger central government and of America playing a bigger role in world economics and world politics, world diplomacy. And so they're already inclined to creating a stronger government. There aren't many men at the convention who are uncertain about this, and that's very helpful to the convention. James Madison comes with a plan in his hand. He's all ready. He knows just what he wants. And very quickly, the most intense nationalists, Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, I think I mentioned him already, start to caucus about how to not just amend the Confederation, but to throw it out entirely and write a new constitution. And that's exactly what they do. They meet in Philadelphia, they lock the doors and windows, they meet in secret, and they, on the second day of the convention, say, let's get rid of the Confederation, let's write a new constitution.
Now, delegates debated extensively about how the people and the states would represent in the national legislature. Most delegates favored one of two representation schemes. The Virginia Plan. This plan favored representation based on population. Delegates from the large states supported this plan because it would give them a great deal of power. Representatives from small states, however, rejected the plan because they would have fewer seats than the larger states and consequently less power. The New Jersey Plan. This plan proposed giving each state equal representation in the legislature. Delegates from smaller states supported the New Jersey Plan because they believed that all states should have equal power regardless of population. Ratification of Constitution. Ratification of the newly created Constitution was not a sure thing. There was a real concern that the document granted too much power to the federal government and would ultimately lead to aristocratic tyranny. Sensing the struggle that lay ahead, the framers wisely stated that the Constitution need only be approved by 9 out of 13 states. They also stipulated that the states would not vote on ratification through their state legislatures, which the founders feared would have great misgivings about the new central government, but rather through a special elective convention. Were it not for these two crucial provisions, the Constitution might not have been ratified at all. This video helps us understand the ratification of the U.S. Constitution.
Is an effort, a real effort, to institute the values expressed in the Declaration of Independence.
So if you go to the National Archives, at the center of the grand room is not the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution.
And to go in and to be able to see the signatures, George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, all on one paper, we owe everything, all the liberties and freedoms that we have to these documents and the men who wrote them.
The Constitution as it emerged from the Federal Convention was nothing but a proposal, and it remained so until the state ratifying debates breathed life into that proposal.
What gives it legitimacy is the way it was ratified by the American people. The Federalist, anti-Federalist debate is probably the most intellectual debate we have ever had in this country.
To this time, the ratification debates have been given relatively little attention. In some ways, they are the most important.
This year of ratification is nothing less than an American Big Bang. It's such a radical change and totally unanticipated.
This was the first time in world history anything like that happened. It was a monumental event.
This year is the hinge of human history. Before this year, democracy exists in very few places on the globe. In today's world, democracy is over half the planet and it's on the march, and it's because, I submit, of this one year. It was epic.
Fundamental law. The human existence in the civilized society may not be completed without the blueprint on the fundamental law of the state and government, which is called Constitution. It focuses on the wide range of political development along the governmental structures, processes, forms and systems that define what we call state. The Constitution is a fundamental and supreme law of the land. It may be written or unwritten constitution. A constitution defines the basic purposes and aspiration of a society, including the common welfare of the people. It provides the general provision on the basic purpose and aspiration of the state. These are scope and content in the formulation constitution. The inclusion of the political aspiration of the state. This entails the political beliefs of the state on its aspiration, ideals of the society along freedom, equality and values. National identity, ideology and governmental values are within the mandate of the state. The provision of the universal constitution and human rights, the constitutional provisions of the various political rights of citizens such as right to vote, right to own property, due process of law and other rights pertaining to the implementation of the democratic rights of individuals. The general governmental structure and branches along the provisions of the executive, legislative and judiciary. Fundamental complementation of the three branches of government as to the implementation of the fundamental law of the land. The civil rights movement. Civil rights groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which was organized in 1909, led the fight to end discrimination by using the courts. Civil disobedience, boycotts and protest demonstration created a climate of opinion that led to legislative steps to end discrimination. Civil disobedience. Civil disobedience means testing an unjust law by deliberately breaking it. This approach was campaigned by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. In 1955, King organized a boycott of the bus service in Montgomery, Alabama, which went on for more than a year until public transportation was desegregated. Cesar Chavez and his largely Mexican-American Farm Workers of America Union led a successful national boycott against table grabs produced by non-union growers a decade later. Sit-ins were used at white-only lunch counters in the South. African Americans who were refused service simply remained in their seats and were replaced by others when the police came to arrest them. News coverage of these events dramatically increased the support for the civil rights movement and brought activists, both black and white, to the South to participate. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which survived several challenges in the courts, prohibited employment discrimination by private businesses connected with interstate commerce, authorized the Attorney General to begin school desegregation lawsuit if complaints were filed, and cut off federal funding for any program that practiced discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin or sex was banned in all forms of housing through the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Racial violence. The advance of civil rights was not accomplished without violence. The images of police in the South using fire hoses and guard dogs against protest marches were powerful and built support for the movement. The non-violent approach of Martin Luther King Jr. was not accepted by all African American leaders. The black Muslims under Malcolm X Malcolm X advocated segregation of the races and were prepared to respond to violence with violence. The Black Panther Party called for black power and in some communities began stockpiling weapons. Race riots broke out in cities across the country, first wave in 1964 and 1965 and then a second one in 1968. Summary. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. The preamble to our United States Constitution states, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." The US Constitution is the oldest national constitution and the shortest. The Constitution created three separate branches of government: legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch. There are 6 foundational principles of the US Constitution: popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, federalism. The two major parties in America are the Democratic and Republican parties. The Constitution is the fundamental and supreme law of the land.